So out of all the games to come out so far in 2022, the one game that surprised me the most was Triangle Strategy. So going in, I thought I'm not sure how this is going. It was kind of a bit of a slow start. But as it went on, I started to realize it was an incredible game and is quite good if you can stick through those first couple of chapters. The one thing I particularly liked about the game was just how grounded the world felt. So there's magic, but you don't have dragons or other type of otherworldly creatures in the game. All of the conflict in this game is between human beings, which is something that not a whole lot of JRPGs do all that often. And it's something that I think makes this game worth looking at. Since the game lacks a lot of these more fantastical elements, it makes the game's political intrigue all that more realistic looking, and actually offers several lessons onto the nature of how politics works. And before we go any further, allow me to offer up the obvious spoiler warning. We're about to discuss a lot of information about a game that is extremely story heavy, so don't say I didn't warn you. So to start things off, let's talk about the thing that makes Triangle Strategy unique: the conviction system. So when it comes to one's different political positions and the policies that they prescribe, one's ethical system plays a major role, perhaps the biggest role, you might say. And sure, maybe some people, okay, most people, haven't actually thought through all of their positions and are more or less just emotionally driven to defend their side, but that's beside the point here. This game maps every decision made by the characters onto one of three axes, labeled morality, utility, and liberty. And so first we're going to go through each of these and use a fairly famous test to differentiate the two: the trolley problem. The basic gist of the trolley problem is that you've got a trolley hurtling towards a group of 5 people, and next to you is a lever, and if you pull it, the trolley is diverted onto a different track. However, in doing so, you kill one person. And so the question is, do you pull the lever? Starting with the axis of morality, this one's quite interesting. So morality is a very broad concept, and honestly can encompass the other two convictions in their entirety. So we need to come up with a more specific definition for how this game uses the word. So by looking at the different choices in the game that are aligned with the morality conviction, we see that there's a fairly clear pattern to them: duty to one's family, concern for the downtrodden, diplomacy in preventing harm, and honesty and loyalty. In effect, all of these choices are ones that appeal to one's moral duty and obligations. And this happens to have a more specific name: deontology. And I know, big scary word. Stay with me here now. The basic gist here is that each action has an inherent moral value to it, based on a set of predetermined rules. A key voice in this philosophy that is usually cited is a man by the name of Immanuel Kant, with his main contribution being known as the categorical imperative. In Kant's view, the duty to follow the categorical imperative is objective, rational, and unconditional, and is universally applied. Secondly, that it's the motives that determine right and wrong, not the outcomes of said actions. So to bring this into the trolley problem, one who adheres to this philosophy would choose basically not to pull the lever, as that represents an action that leads to the death of another person, which in this worldview is always wrong, regardless of the circumstances. To bring this into the context of one of the game's 3 bad endings, Frederica represents morality, as she views what is happening to the Roselle and Hyzant is wrong and must be righted, with no other considerations really being made. Slavery is bad, therefore it must be abolished. Standing in contrast to this idea is the concept of utility. In this case, the choices here involve those that appear to have a net positive outcome. In ethics, the concept of utilitarianism is the theory that what is right is that which maximizes utility for the population. Now, what utility is a bit up for debate. Classical utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill tended to focus on human happiness, or what we sometimes call pleasure. Others contest that there needs to be maybe a bit more of a holistic approach to utility that extends a little bit more beyond just the concept of pleasure. Either way, however, the logic is the same. The best course of action is that which produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, one might say. So in contrast to the morality approach to the trolley problem, the utility approach says that you should pull the lever, as 5 people living leads to higher net utility than just 1. In this context, Roland represents the utility ending, as he allows the enslavement of the Roselle to continue because he sees it as leading to a better positive outcome for everyone else in Norzelia. Now moving into maybe the bit of the odd one out in this conversation is the topic of liberty. And the theme of these choices is kind of a bit harder to pin down. So after going over them for a little bit, I concluded that they seem to be about more or less rejecting one's prescribed duty or doing things that seem to be directly in your best interest. And similar to the problem with morality, the term freedom or liberty are also quite broad. So usually when we talk about freedom, scholars tend to divide it into 2 main types: negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is generally understood to be a freedom from restriction. More or less, the government cannot prohibit you from doing certain things. Examples of this would be freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and so on. Positive freedom, on the other hand, is understood as your capacity to do something. Proponents of positive freedom argue that it's not simply enough to theoretically be capable of doing certain things to be free. You must also be able to realize your highest potential. Now, to bring this back into the way the game defines the liberty choices, you can see that this game leans hard into the negative aspect of freedom. When it comes to different ethical philosophies, acting in a way that's directed towards your own benefit is what is called egoism. Actions are right, more or less, when they benefit you. The focus is on fulfilling your wants and desires, regardless of what others think. So when moving into the trolley problem, whether or not you pull the lever depends on whether or not you seek to gain from it personally, but you have no obligation towards either direction. Is the one person someone you care about, or do you care more about any one of the 5 people? Ultimately though, the important thing to note here is that you need to have the choice to decide whether or not you pull the lever for yourself. No one can force your hand in that matter. In this regard, Benedict represents the liberty ending, as his personal goal of seeing Serenoa rise to power is fulfilled. In addition, we see the negative freedom aspect come in with the fate of the Roselle, as sure, they're liberated from slavery, but they're not given much assistance upon which to build their new lives, which can lead to problems. Emancipated slaves generally don't have much, if any, capital to work with, so they typically need some help, but they're denied that in this ending. So something that's worth noting is that when I named those characters, you might have noticed that the convictions they were associated with were not the ones they were at the beginning of the game. They all change convictions at some point during the story. The thing that's worth noting here, though, is that the one that leaves the party in each of these 3 endings is the one that doesn't align with that conviction at all, but they will go along with the plan that matches their original conviction. What this goes to show is that no one really holds the belief in any one of these convictions completely in isolation. In addition, these endings go to show the flaws of each of these convictions when placed into an extreme. And so, that brings us to this game's 4th ending, the Golden Route, which leads to what is supposed to be the best ending in the game. Here we see the game seem to lean into the idea that you need a balance between the 3 convictions, which is shown by all 3 flames on the scales of conviction lighting up when Serenoa reaches a solution to the problem presented in Chapter 17. What this ending does is that it uses all 3 convictions in the battles in Chapter 18, and then causes a course of action that leads to the best possible outcome for Norzelia, while avoiding a lot of the negative externalities we saw in the regular endings. The land is at peace, the Roselle are free and integrated into greater Norzelian society, and Hyzan's conformist ways are done away with, as is Esfrost's brutal meritocracy. However, these convictions do not make a coherent politics. Ideas are nice and all, but power needs a basis of legitimacy. And in this respect, there are key words that you need to remember. No man rules alone. Throughout the game, we see a series of shifting alliances between characters, as well as the importance of specific individuals in helping people legitimize and maintain their power. This mirrors a theory put forth by political scientists Bruce Bruno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith in their book, The Dictator's Handbook. By far, this book's biggest claim to fame is the CGP Grey video entitled Rules for Rulers, which borrows heavily from their ideas. The key idea that both the book and video put forward is that in order to maintain one's power, a ruler must be able to get key supporters on their side, that being generals, bankers, law enforcement, and so forth. And in order to get that support, one must be able to give people what they want. Generally, this is done with treasure from the state's vaults, but can also be given out in other ways, i.e. political favors. A good example of this idea of key supporters who help maintain power are the royalists in the Kingdom of Glenbrook. In the game, we see them get away with quite a bit of corrupt shit, but they never ever really face any comeuppance for their crimes because their support is necessary for the royal family to stay in power. Of course, corruption like this tends to hurt the citizenry, as giving large sums of money to various individuals deprives resources that could otherwise be spent on bettering societal welfare. The governments that tend to spend the most on their people are democracies, as the people themselves, or rather various blocks of people, are the keys to power as opposed to individuals, although there are individuals typically involved in democracies, but that's beside the point. Whereas in dictatorships, they tend to spend very little, because poor, starving peasants make for poor revolutionaries. Now, generally speaking, these rules apply to nation-states at all times, including in peacetime. However, that is not the case for the majority of this game. The majority of this game takes place in a period of war, and that's a case where political alliances are vital. Power is ultimately won and maintained through violence, and to that end, one needs soldiers. In the case of Glenbrook, we typically see what happens when a nation falls. Each of those who maintain the power of the old regime have to choose sides. Do they attempt to defend the old regime, or do they side with the new one? Serenoa obviously sides with the old regime, and if the player chooses to protect Roland during Chapter 7, we see House Falks join the fray out of their personal loyalty to the crown. House Tellior and the Royalists, however, end up switching sides as they see that as the better option to help them gain and not lose their power. In the case of House Tellior, we see him later switch to side with Hyzant following the player deciding to defend the Roselle. Again, seeing something that would be in his best interest regardless of any personal loyalties. In the case of existing regimes, one can also be a threat if the keys to power decide that you got on their bad side a little too much. For example, Svarog is quite skeptical surrounding the circumstances of his son's death, and if the player is able to successfully win him over as an ally, he pledges himself to Serenoa and Roland to help overthrow Gustadolf should the time come, which, during the Golden Ending, does. In addition, the player also tries to carve out political alliances with Hyzant, and this is a case where Hyzant has something to gain over House Wolffort, namely the Roselle who are settled in the Wolffort domain. According to Hyzant's teachings, all the Roselle must be condemned to the source for a sin that was committed by their ancestors, and to that end, they see this as a means to reclaim those that they lost during the Saltiron Wars. Hyzant knows that Serenoa needs their loyalty to take back Glenbrook, and they're using that to achieve their own ends. So for this next topic, we're going to pivot away from the rulers themselves and towards the rule. And so I've already talked a little bit about the idea of negative versus positive liberty and how this game leans in the negative liberty direction. However, I want to look at this idea in greater detail, because there is substantial debate between these two ideas. The primary point of contention here is that positive liberty, in order to be maintained, generally require some type of government redistribution of wealth. Some, like the philosopher Robert Nozick, claim that since negative liberties ought be absolute, positive liberties cannot exist. These rights require a substructure of things and materials and actions, and other people may have rights and entitlements over these. Proponents of positive liberty, however, push back on this absolute interpretation of negative rights, arguing that that does not maximize freedom, as being able to theoretically do something is worthless without the capital to actualize it. Now, this isn't to say that they argue for total equality amongst people. Supporters of positive liberty, like the philosopher John Rawls, claim that some equality is fine as long as said inequalities are structured so that they are in the benefit to the least advantaged in society. On that note, however, let's talk about Hyzant. Hyzant is meant to represent utility, and are shown to have a people who live in total equality. Now, clearly that's wrong. As the characters point out fairly early on, how can you say that all people are equal when each individual person has different wants and desires? That's kind of a major sticking point, is it not? These remarks actually mirror Rawls's criticism of utilitarianism. He claims that utilitarians have a tendency to abstract everyone in society into one single hypothetical person, and use his interests and desires to determine what is the best outcome. To this end, he claims utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between persons. In effect, everyone might have the same level of wealth and the same number of possessions, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be happy. We see in various cases people who are discontented with the state of things in Hyzant, but have to go along because that's what society requires them. And so, by having people live in complete equality, you erode their negative freedoms, which then pulls into question whether or not they have any positive freedoms to begin with. And there's also that whole slavery thing too, that kind of undermines this idea that everyone in your society is equal if an entire ethnic group is condemned to forced labor. Just saying. Just saying. However, what we see here is that what this game tries to get across is that absolute negative freedom, like we see in Aesfrost, and absolute positive freedom, like we see in Hyzant, are not ideal states for society. Ideally, you need a balance between the two ideas, which is actually what Rawls proposes. His two principles that underpin his seminal work, A Theory of Justice, represent each of those ideals. He provides a series of basic guaranteed freedoms that everyone should have, while prescribing that we maintain a wealth distribution that ensures that everyone has the actual ability to take advantage of those freedoms and make something for themselves. Like with the convictions, we must weigh all possible factors and find a point between the two that leads to the best possible outcomes. So overall, when it comes to the politics of this game, we do need to see that this is still a work of fiction set in a world that is quite different from the one we currently inhabit. And so there are a fair number of limitations that come with that. Still, it provides a very interesting look into how rulers rule and the various convictions that underpin people's various ideologies. With that, I can definitively say that Triangle Strategy is a game that is worth checking out if you haven't already. This is a very interesting story and, honestly, quite interesting gameplay too. I didn't talk that much about it, but, it can be a fun game if you're into strategy RPGs. So, if you enjoyed Fire Emblem Three Houses, you'll probably like this. But I've kept you guys long enough, so I will see you guys in the next video.